Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, Ari's here. He's been here a few times talking about other subjects, but today he's going to be talking about his area of expertise, which is issues to do with gender, and he is the editor emeritus of the Journal of Gender Studies. He's the co-editor of the book Crossing Sexual Boundaries, Transgender Journeys. And he's the only speaker we've ever had here whose papers are in the Harvard Library. I always like saying that. So anyway, here's Ari. The book is called Raising My Rainbow by Lori, I guess you say it Duron. So here's Ari.
Okay.
For the official beginning.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome to the Sanford Library, one of my favorite watering holes for expanding my feelings about various issues. And one of my favorites is, of course, the topic of gender. This particular phase of it is one of the newer aspects in terms of what a parent needs to go through, not what a professional needs to go. They need to go through a lot of retraining, frankly. But getting a professional person after they've got a doctorate and a PhD and an XYZ and all these other degrees, they don't want to go back to school for extensive training unless they get CEU credits. Now, am I talking to a crowd who understands what I'm talking about here? CEU credits, continuing education credits. Now, imagine a guy who's a psychiatrist who's already spent 20 years going through the paces of what makes us tick and not tick, and then he's got to go for another one of these courses. Now, if it was given in Acapulco, he might go down, but you got to get the professionals down there too to talk about it. I have been blessed. I think I was a gender non-conforming child. I can't be sure because nobody had the term out there. You know, we live on terms, so if we say something, it sort of puts a label on you. And one of the worst labels we have been able to do in this century, no, the last century and this century, is to label children, particularly under 5 years old, with a gender that may not be appropriate. Hello? How could my boy ever be anything else but a young man and becoming an adult guy and whatever else, or a female in the direction of the femininity? But we have found that gender is not dependent on your biology so much. It's dependent on the social interaction and parental guidance and all the other factors that help a child grow in a society that is very diverse. And gender diversity now is no longer just an anomaly, but it's more of a norm. Now, when you mention that to a psychiatrist, he'll say, well, you must be crazy, because well, I know when my boy was born a male, he was going to be John Wayne or somebody, you know, in that ilk, and I'd never have to worry about him playing basketball because he's going to be 7'9" or whatever. Or it's a girl, and of course she's going to be the princess of whatever. But when you get a child, 2 years old, who says, Mommy, I want to wear your skirt. And the mother looks at the child, it was a male child, and says, why do you want to do that, CJ? When the name of the person in this book is CJ. CJ is a 3-year-old, and this book, Raising My Raisin, which I will just delegate like that, is this, actually, I said Raising My Raisin, which is really a misnomer. It's Raising My Rainbow, but it's the same thing. Raisin or rainbow, what is important is that the mother of this child really went through a tremendous education about gender, about sexuality, about her child, her husband, her relationships, and the professional help that she sought on the internet. So this book is sort of like a compendium blog. That's the new word. The word is blog in this culture today. And in order to get understanding about what she was experiencing in her home, she went to the internet and with various kinds of suggestions, created a blog about this child and the experiences she, her husband, and her older son, who's 3 years older than this young tiger, had in the period of learning. And so what I propose to do today is to talk a little bit about her and her family, and then read excerpts from the chapters, because there are 36 very short chapters in this book, but each one is filled with an event, which if you've been a parent and had any kind of variations or deviations from the way your child was growing up, you could relate to some of this. And even if you haven't, there's now a sense of empathy about parents who are so blessed, as she says, about having a gender creative or a gender non-conforming child. The word gender non-conforming is really important here, because that's how you can describe a child who likes cars and is very male, or a child who likes dresses and is also very male. And dresses is a misnomer, because no child wears dresses. They wear mother's T-shirt or a big shirt or whatever. And maybe the child might wear her shoes for an occasion. But here there were some really interesting events as to how this child unfolded her gender nonconformity. So I'm going to share a little bit of that in the reading here. She calls her son a gender creative child, which means that instead of following the proscripts or what is called the established norms, and the word quote around norms, about what little boys and little girls do, what she does is sort of talk about CJ as her gender non-conforming child. And she learned that term off of the internet, because unbeknownst to her, there are other parents who had the same problem. In fact, it was more than just the occasional place like in Albany or in New York City. They're out in the Midwest. They're all over the country. And when she founded this blog, she got emails from all over, many of which were inquiring about what they had found and how to share. And then there was some pretty negative and I would say almost defamatory kinds of commentary. You know, when you do these blogs these days, people get up, you are a pervert, you are a prevert, you are whatever. And without any reason to know anything more than you wrote something that is going against the grain of the social norms of 21st century America, which if anybody here can give me what are the social norms of 21st century America, I'd be happy to learn about them. I'm finding myself as a visitor to the planet. And all the things I did in the latter part of the 20th century may have some relevance in the 21st century, but I'm relegated to being a speaker, you know, and talking about all the wonderful things I had in my life. And gender was one of them. And in the talk about various things regarding things we want to know about the gender spectrum, this will be helpful for most of us toward the end of the talk. As I said, the book is 36 so-called chapters. They're not labeled, but as you read each chapter, it's very clear what she was trying to get across. And I'm going to read pieces of some of those, but what I want to make sure you understand is that at all points, her sons, there are two of them, one is called Chase and the other is called CJ. CJ is the gender non-conforming child. Chase is 3 years older, and he's the gender-conforming child. When I say gender-conforming, nobody pays attention because boys like toys and Legos and whatever else, and he's doing the right thing for his so-called gender development. They're both males, and to my understanding, they are not dysfunctional males, although at age 3 and age 6, you don't expect too much function. As long as they know how to pee and know how to go to the bathroom and have been toilet trained, I mean, that's what you're hoped for. But this is all in great flux as we get diapers that can absorb gallons of moisture. The culture is absolutely phenomenal when you think about all the things we have created as adult norms. and we can apply them to children in a way that is growth-oriented or positive about themselves. One of the biggest problems we have is developing a sense of identity about who I am as a child. And in most cases, everybody says, well, he was born, you know, as a male. Apparently his sexual equipment looks okay, but underneath that, there could be a micro-vagina. We have found more and more that the pediatricians and the obstetricians have really missed a very important part of their training when they fail to look at all the parts of an emerging infant. And more we're discovering people who have anatomies that are variants from the gender expectation. So if the amniocentesis tells you it's going to be a male child, that may be at one point, but there may be some vestigial structure or hormonal things which you can't see. You can't see hormones. You can see the effect of them. Now, even at birth, a child is born with essential hormones that will ultimately develop into gonads and develop into sexually mature organs which may be able to provide reproduction. On the other hand, there are a number of children who don't have that capability and won't have it because of genetic defects or genetic alternatives. The DNA molecule, which is, I think I sent one word on here, has been described as, we now know the code. Well, that's great, 4 billion kinds of little chemical substances, the sequence of which is so complicated, it would take 4 computers to really figure out for each of us what that is. And even though it's pretty clear for most of the, let's say the simians or the mammals of the higher caliber, particularly the simians, that's the monkeys and all those other people, they're very similar with very small changes. So similar that you can actually train chimpanzees to do a number of things at a certain level that seem to be natural for any of this species of Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens, but of mammal. In any event, I'm not going to talk about biology at this point because this book focuses on the gender issues. And I mentioned that CJ is the younger child. He is the gender nonconformist. The father in this foursome is Matt. He is the parent. He's employed as a local law enforcement officer in Orange County, California. And the mother, who wrote the book, is a female parent, and she's employed in web development and is the guiding light for both of these children. She looks at herself as a gender creative parent who has explored and experienced the development of her son, the non-conforming CJ. She writes these, I guess, these chapters in a blog type form so that if you went to the internet, you probably could get pieces of it from her as well as what's been printed in this book. And what she does is try to observe CJ in his various explorative or creative modes about gender. Now, since he isn't clear about whether gender is a he or a she, he decides to just use the props that give him pleasure. And the ones that give him pleasure are the doll. Now, if you're an adult and you see a boy child playing with a doll, your first indication is this child is got a problem. And that is not true. Lots of children play with dolls. There's Ken, the male form of the Barbie doll, and a lot of male children identify with that. We never hear about it because in this culture, which is male-dominated, we never understand what is gender appropriate. And girls do like Lego, and they do know how to do arithmetics, and they do know how to organize things the way males would. We don't know why, but we know that the culture that is now open to so much diversity allows these children to explore without having to put a stigma on it. So here we see the mother going through the patterns of her son, first with girly things. She calls them girly things because this child is not feminine. Feminine meaning that she has a genotype or a phenotype that allows us to say, well, this is a little girl. The only way you know an infant from being a male or a female child, besides examining the genitalia, is by the color of the clothes they wear. And what do girls wear when they first come into? What's the word? Starts with P. Ooh. And for boys, blue. Okay. So, and we all learned that from the New York Times and everybody else who ever wrote about how you raise your child, including Dr. Spock. Anybody remember Dr. Spock? I mean, I'm talking to an audience at least that understands something about what we did in the 20th century. Anybody under 30 may have heard about Spock, about Freud, about Carl Jung, and some of the other major players of this. But unless they've gone to really a detailed graduate program in the social dynamics of the 20th and 21st century, we really don't know these major players anymore. And they're like things of the past. They are things of the past. But their relevance is still good for today's times. So what are there any questions up to now about where I'm directing everybody? Yes, please. Yes, and she was another one. Yes, Karen Horney was a very important player in the social development. Yes.
Are you proposing, I mean, is gender determination something objective or subjective?
Aha, good question. Gender determination is really in the eyes of the kid, not in the parents. The parents would like to see a gender conformity pattern associated with the biologic sex of the child. The biologic meaning the anatomical part. After that, we don't know. There was a tendency in this family to try and coerce the gender non-conforming child to find things that made him feel good, and they were more male-oriented, like Legos or stuff.
Maybe I missed something here. Could you use the word coerce? In the books of the parent was trying to coerce?
No, not coerce so much. I didn't mean to use that word in this sense, but coerce meaning that if a child was playing more with a doll, why not give him a choo-choo train or something that would relate to the idea that his gender formation and his biologic sex are sort of in sync. That is, he's not playing with dolls because he loves to have a child of his own and play like that. You get my point is that the object of the child here is what gives him some kind of sense of pleasure. Okay, any other kinds of questions? Yes? No? Okay. Okay, so let me read a few of these things, and I'll raise some more questions about it. When it was first discovered that CJ is gender nonconforming, the parents had a lot of problems with how do I define my son? He likes to wear skirts, and he's not interested in togs or anything that males usually wear, at least young males. She says, when I started writing, I knew I had an effeminate son who we assumed was gay. Now, all that is all bullshit, because how do you know a child is going to be gay is an activity that comes when you have sexual development. There is no sexual development here. He's still a child. And her perception then at this point was that I'm going to have a gay child. And this comes out of the social development of how we think about children who do gender nonconforming things. We either say they're either off the wall or a turnip truck, or they're going to be this, or they are this. Now, at 2 years old, this book is focused on 2 to 5. Anything after that is another chapter, another decade, whatever. But it's all that pre-gender and sexuality moment, the puberty period. So I didn't know that a gender creative, gender nonconforming, gender variant son with gender dysphoria and or gender disorder. So her views, a person's sex is either male or female based on their genitalia / reproductive organs, internal and external. If you have a penis, your sex is male. If you have a vagina, your sex is female. She never says anything about if you have maybe one or both, because there are children that are born with vestiges, anatomical vestiges of one or the other. And we have a lot of cases now which we now classify as intersexed. And as they begin to develop, there is a lot of variation that takes place. This is not the subject for intersexuality, but in the handout, I talk about 1 in 2,000 babies in the United States can be classified as intersexed. And when they become pubescent, it's more clear because then they develop secondary sexual characteristics that are not typical for that genotype or phenotype.
What percentage did you say?
1 in 2,000 babies.
1 in
2,000 babies annually. Okay. And that data is in the handout, and we could talk more about that if you care to. One of the things that even she was confounded about, when is my child really being female? And it's a non-relevant. She didn't know that at the time. So she had to go to the blog and go to the internet to really get some distinction between my child as a female playing with male toys or my child as a male playing with female toys. Now, when you put female and toy together, that's really a non sequitur, because the toys have no sex. They may have a gender, but they don't have a sex, unless you're making mannequins for genitalia, which a lot of people do for various reasons. Now, a person's sexuality can be heterosexual. That's different from having a sex. Your biologic sex tells you one thing, but your sexuality is determined by the social interactions and the early experiences, not experiences, but awareness that your sexuality either provides a way in which you can reproduce. And sexuality and all the variants that go with that are the subject for pubescent children, more or less teenagers, and then young adults. By the time you reach 30, you either have passed a lot of this stuff, or you're so involved in it that you become trans. And all of a sudden, we have another category between he, she's, and the non-development that is the trans person. And there are a whole bunch of categories that go with that. That is not the subject of this talk today, unfortunately. But that's a major thing, and I have some references in the handout that will give you some feeling about that. My readers and further research finally helped me to give a name to CJ's disconnect between sex and gender. It was a life-changing moment when I read the definition of childhood gender nonconformity. Guess where? Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia is the Bible. I can't get rid of my encyclopedia. Anybody have a whole set of the encyclopedia? Did you try getting rid of them? They don't even want to take them in the library here. I mean, that's the most incredible experience. And Wikipedia becomes the new Bible for the 21st century. And some of it's okay. Anyway, she went to the, and she said, she wrote this thing down here. Childhood gender nonconformity is a phenomenon in which prepubescent children do not conform to expected gender-related sociological or psychological patterns and or identify with the opposite gender. There's no such thing as opposite gender. Other gender is okay, but there's no opposite. Just because he's a he doesn't mean he's a she or not a she. It's the what they call the attribute structure, which is another thing we could talk hours about. But it's not opposite. There's no male and female opposites. There are differences, but they're not opposites. Okay. Typical behavior among those who exhibit the phenomenon includes, but is not limited to, a propensity to cross-dress, a refusal to take part in activities conventionally thought suitable for the gender and the exclusive choice of playmates of the opposite sex. Now, this is all quote from Wikipedia that she's talking about here. Anyway, the key that she talks about is the therapeutic community is currently divided on proper response to childhood gender nonconformity. Childhood gender nonconformity is heritable. That means it's learned. Okay, our son is gender nonconforming. So she now has a label for her son and all the behaviors that he does. And she describes some of them. And I'm going to read just a piece of one of them. His third birthday, he wants to go to Disneyland. Anybody been to Disneyland? Not Disney World, Disneyland. That's in California. She lives in Orange County, so Disneyland is down there. And they have the Hall of Princesses. And CJ wants to go to the Hall of Princesses and meet the other princesses of this category. I'm trying to find, here we are. The child for the third birthday wants to go to Disney World and go to the Disneyland area called Ariel's Grotto, Ariel, A-R-I-E-L. And it's there where the Hall of the Princesses are. Now, who are these princesses? Well, there's the Barbies, there is Rapunzel, there is Cinderella, and there are a couple of others that she mentions there, the Barbies, Virginia Slims, and on and on. So the rest of the day was, so they go to this thing and they have lunch there, and he meets the princesses. He meets Princess Rapunzel and Princess Cinderella and Princess whatever they are, Alice in Wonderland. We headed straight for Fantasyland for the Alice in Wonderland ride because CJ wanted to ride Caterpillar for those who do not speak 4-year-old, and fall down in the rabbit hole. For those who want to see the Alice in Wonderland thing, we rode ride after ride after ride. Then we hit the high note of our day, Disney Princesses Fantasy Fair. And after all, CJ wanted to visit Disneyland to see his princesses. I had read on Disneyland's website as I planned our day, meet some of your favorite Disney princesses in person at the Disney Princess Fantasy Fair. And so they talk about these things. Snow White, Aurora, also known as the Sleeping Beauty, and Jasmine. So CJ had a wonderful day meeting people he related to in this gender sense. And as odd as it sounded, he had a great time. The parents were surprised, but they had a good time as well. So this opened up a whole new feeling about what are we talking about with a gender nonconforming child. And so she goes on and talks about various things. And then one of the key things at age 4, she goes to the pediatrician that they've had for some time for the annual checkup or appointment. And the pediatrician looked a little bewildered and referred to us to the Department of Psychiatry, where we got an appointment a few weeks later with a child psychiatrist. Did I think that CJ needed mental help at that point? No, but I was eager to talk to anybody who might have experience or with information about gender nonconforming children. We walked into the psychiatrist's office, and CJ made a beeline for the toy castle in the corner. He cleared all of the knights, K-N-I-G-H-T, out and gathered the princesses for play. The fro-headed white doctor in a Tommy Bahama shirt observed him. We observed the doctor observing him. Oh, there's one other form I need you to fill out. Now, this is really a classic when you go to these things. And I'm not sure they still do it, but when they do. Anyway, there's one other form I need you to fill out, the doctor said, handing me 3 sheets of paper with questions printed on the front and the back. You know, when you get these physicals, right? Across the top of the first page, it read, test for sexual deviance. Now, mind you, this is a 4-year-old. It's standard in cases like these, the doctor assured her, after I'm sure I've made some sort of face while reading the title. Does your child masturbate? him or herself. No. Has your child tried to masturbate someone other than him, herself? God, no. Has your child experienced penile distress? This is the psychiatrist giving this to the parents, and the child is only 4 years old here. Okay, and it goes on and on. I mean, you have to laugh at this, and yet it was protocol for the psychiatrist to get all his data. Okay, so the husband is with Lori and the child, and Matt grabbed the papers from me thinking that I was being defiant when maybe I should be compliant. His eyes grew big and his face grew red, and he scanned the questions. No, that's not our son, he sternly said. Push the papers back toward the doctor. From there, things in the tiny psychiatry office grew awkward and very, very quiet as all eyes went to CJ, not wanting to go anywhere else. What? CJ said, noticing that we were all watching him. Nothing, baby, I said. We all smiled. I was fighting back tears. As our appointment was nearing an end, the doctor looked through one of his magic books and then confirmed what I had already learned online. CJ was gender non-conforming. The doctor told us that CJ had no need for continuing treatment and gave us some generic parental handouts, which I threw in the trash as we exited the building. Okay, so here are two parents who, wanting help, go to the psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, according to the book here, and she finds out it's totally useless. And then other things go on. She talks about getting to know the Matthew Shepard Foundation. You all know the story about Matthew Shepard. He was brutally killed on the border between Colorado and I think Wyoming. And he was a gay guy going through some school, and the two people were rabid homophobes, and they really massacred him. And it got all over the national journals and stuff, and courted the hate crime, fostered the hate crime bill, and so forth. We have found out recently that Matthew Shepard also was a drug he sold some drugs, and he welched on a deal, and that's why they wanted to kill him. That's what they find out 30 years after the case of this guy. Anyway, she's finding out all this information from these various sources, and it could be terribly confounding to anybody who reads all the things that she found out. The key thing that she said, she found new research in the Journal of Pediatrics to suggest that gay, lesbian, and bisexual young adults from very rejecting families, as opposed to families who were neutral or mildly rejecting, are nearly 6 times more likely to have major depression and 3 to 5 times more likely to use illegal drugs and have unprotected sex, the article reported. Now I ask you, I mean, if you were parents and reading this stuff, you'd say, what am I doing here? This is totally out of character. I can read, but what's the import here? Here my child is 4 years old, and I'm looking at stuff that has no relevance to him, but they always put it in that various context, like pediatrics or obstetrics, or there are no journals anymore on gender diversity. I put out a journal 20 years ago now, I guess, the Journal of Gender Studies, which featured some of the hallmark stuff, but nothing has really emerged about gender or transgender except by the dint of the individuals who are in that cohort. Anyway, so there are so many wonderful stories that she talks about, but I think one that really has relevance, because she sees light at the end of the tunnel, which is really great. This is one of the key chapters. I got particularly absorbed in a book that had just been released titled Gender Born, Gender Made by Diane Aronsoft, PhD, which was written as a guidebook for raising healthy gender nonconforming children. I swear Aronsoft is the patron saint of kids who don't conform to traditional gender norms. On and on here. Okay. Aaron Soft, I guess the name is, a developmental and clinical psychologist who has worked with gender nonconforming children and their families for the past quarter of a century, hoped to carve a path toward gender health for all the children and youth who go against the normative gender grain of our culture. She called these children gender creative instead of the usual gender variant or gender nonconforming. Her book should be recommended reading for all parents, blah, blah, blah. Erin Soft can relate to parents of gender creative kids because she is one. So here we have somebody who made the professional grade and is actually able to distill some really good data from it, according to her at least. She has a grown son who was gender creative and now identifies as gay. Before her, I had only read and heard from people who were experts on gender nonconforming children through a limited amount of study and or observation. Never before had I heard from a credentialed expert who had actually parented a gender nonconforming child. She explains that gender creative is a developmental position in which the child transcends the culture's normative definitions of male and female to creatively interweave a sense of gender that comes neither totally from the inside, the body, the psyche, nor totally from the outside, the culture and other perceptions, but resides somewhere in between. Aaron Soft acknowledges the harm done to gender creative children should they fall into the wrong hands. And so it goes on and on. So one of the key themes out of this book is the idea that when you have a child that doesn't sort of follow the rules of what gender is, they call them gender nonconforming. And her child is one of those. And at one point, she feels that this is getting overwhelming for her, and what happens if she were to pass? What would her husband do about this gender nonconforming child? So what she did what they would call a social experiment with herself. She wrote a letter to her husband in the event that she was going to die, and how he should take care of the children. And so in it are her feelings about how she felt about how CJ has been so important to her. Now, she didn't encourage CJ. I want to make that point. She tried as much as possible to steer a neutral course, but sometimes the child knows what they want, and until they decide that they don't want it, you don't force it on them. And she was one of those parents. And she found that there are a lot of other parents out there. In fact, in Orange County, there are lots of parents because they all went to her blog and asked her about gender nonconformity after she was learning about it herself. So this letter was really a message of empathy. When you get a situation in which you're really not clear about which way to go, either in developmental or in personal judgments about gender, sexuality, or whatever it is that's on your mind, one of the best tools is to write a letter to a loved one explaining what this was all about. Now, I didn't do that in my life, but I wrote a book about all those people who wanted to explain it but never had a place to do it. And so just to tout a book that I did in 2008 with a healthcare professional called Crossing Sexual Boundaries. It's 20 autobiographies of transgender people, some of whom went for surgery, some of whom didn't go for surgery, some were males, and some were females. And this compendium of the people who in adulthood had to make these terrible decisions, in the long run, were sane enough to write about their lives over the decades until they got transformed. There are a couple of other things I'd like to just say a few words about here before I open it up for discussion. Let's see what else that I wanted. There are a lot of events that happen with a child in school, and I won't labor talking about those. At one point, she finds that talking to the teacher about CJ, he's going to preschool, and by letting the teacher know that her child is gender nonconforming, which the teacher, by the way, had no idea about. How do you define the child that's gender nonconforming? And you see it in the play behavior among all the preschoolers, which are young males and females. And CJ likes to play with the girls and plays, home and taking care of babies and stuff like that. He doesn't want to play with the boys. So the mother is making sure that the teacher is aware that this is one of the special qualities of this child. And that helps an awful lot, because in the preschool period is when children really begin to ferret out their gender awareness, or lack thereof, or nonconformity. And all three of those things are possible. Staying gender neutral on the part of the parent is quite a challenge. And one of the things the teachers, especially, there are some groups now like GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight, Educational Network. In almost every major school system, in New York State at least, there is a chapter of GLSEN. And if a child has some gender or sexuality questions that are delicate and can't be answered, or the parents are not aware of it, they can talk to the GLSEN representative in that school system. Now, that's something that we never had in the 20th century, right to the end. It wasn't until the turn of the century into the 21st that we could collect and get to know people who were open enough to want to share the complexities of gender for adolescents, teenagers, and preschoolers. So that's a piece of that. The last thing I want to say about this is the business of bullying, because this is an ideal situation to bully. Now, how does it take place? And she talks about this in the later chapters of the book. The older son and the child, CJ, the subject of the talk here, go to the same elementary school. CJ's enrolled in the pre-kindergarten program, and the older boy is in the second grade. And at one point, they observe CJ in this very non-conforming role with a lot of the little girls and so forth. And one kid in Chase's, that's the older brother, class, starts to say, CJ and Chase are homosexual. Second grade now. Kids learn these words, whether they mean them or not. And I gather from the conversation here that the child was harassed, and he was feeling very uncomfortable about having to defend his brother, who is gender nonconforming, but kids don't know about gender nonconformity unless they see it and know about it. And he was bullying the older boy, and the older boy started to get physically very distraught, had stomach aches, had headaches, didn't want to go to school, and was afraid of recrimination should he tell somebody that he's being bullied. And the word was not even around when she wrote this. I think it was, but in the 20th century, who ever heard of, you got bullied, but you got over it, or you never got over it. I was bullied, but for different reasons. And it took me at least 2 years to get over the idea that it was a black person stealing my lunch. I used to put my lunch in the wardrobe. We used to have wardrobes in my day. And you put your lunch in the wardrobe, and it was there, and with it was my lunch. Well, one day my lunch was missing, so I went to the teacher and told the teacher. And he said, well, we'll find out who that is. And they found out who it was. And this guy admitted that he didn't have food, and he needed something to eat, so there was a lunch. So I wasn't apologetic, but I was pretty angry that my lunch was being used to eat this guy. I had no idea that he was, into starvation or whatever. It took me a year to get over the idea that I had told on him, because he was kind of angry about that. A year and a half later, I'm in a park, and this is the Bronx, New York, and I'm playing stickball or some other kind of game, and I'm getting surrounded by a group of black or mixed racial people who asked me to sit down. Now, this is up in the park. No concrete here. It was all grass. So I'm sitting, and I'm surrounded by 4 or 5 of these pretty hulking-looking black guys. One was mulatto, and he was the ringleader. And they said, "We here," and he started to, in the vernacular, talk about, "You've been snitching on one of our boys." And this is a year and a half after. And I couldn't believe that I was being bullied. And one guy took out a knife, and he started to throw it between my fingers. And I kept saying, "I hope you don't miss." Anyway, I was turning white, green, whatever color, to figure out how I'm going to get out of the situation. It turned out they were not in a very angry mood. They didn't slit my throat or cut my fingers off, which all could have happened. But ever since then, it set up a whole dynamic where if I think about it again, when I'm in a situation even remotely close to this idea of threat, I go into that mode where, how do I protect myself? I'm sorry, I'm not talking into these very sensitive microphones. But that's an example of the bullying. What she did, first wrote to the principal and to the teacher about bullying of her son. Got no response from the teacher or from the principal. So then she said, "I'm going to go to the ACLU." And so she went and kept doing all this. Finally, she got the principal to issue a statement about bullying for the whole school. And that way, that bullying had stopped. The child, after a year and going to another class, or they moved the bullier into another class, helped an awful lot. Here's a situation where the brother is empathetic with his younger brother about being gender nonconforming, interpreted by a kid who has no idea about gender except some kind of terms that he's heard on these programs that are all over the television, and how the parent handled it. So that's the overview of this thing. It's worth a read because she's so animated about what she talks about. There's a lot of good information in here if you have friends or children who have gender nonconforming children. I assume you're mostly grandparents of one form or another, and this might befall you at some point. It is now available, whereas it wasn't available maybe a decade ago. One last thing I want to say, then I'll stop and open it for questions. At the back of the book, she does 2 things. First, she has some appendices, and I'll tell you about those in a minute, but I think it's a conclusion that I like. She writes a concluding chapter, and I'll just read a couple of excerpts from it. CJ entered kindergarten as a boy, a gender nonconforming little boy who has taught us enormous lessons in expectations, empathy, and evolutions. He has taught us that you don't always get what you expect when you are expecting. CJ has taught us that we want most from other people, what we want most from other people is empathy. We know that most people don't fully understand the distinctions among gender, sex, and sexuality. We just ask that they have open hearts and open minds and imagine for a minute what our children and we have to deal with on a daily basis. CJ sparked an evolution in our family when he touched that first Barbie. No one in our family is the same person they were 3 years ago. Our multi-generational family has not always gracefully handled the gender nonconformity of its youngest member. We know where we all stand, even if it's not always side by side. CJ has also made us question things. Have gender nonconforming kids always existed? Why are they just now being talked about? Good question to ask a mother in the 21st century. Are kids who play freely with gender automatically LGBTIQ? That's the alphabet for the lesbian, gay, whatever. Is there any benefit to identifying the next generation of LGBT community at a younger age than in the generations past? It is appropriate to think about sexuality of a child who hasn't even started kindergarten, let alone entered puberty. Hopefully, by raising awareness, we'll eventually begin to initiate change and acceptance. That's what she would love to see. People like CJ give the world color. Last item from this conclusion, parenting is hard as hell. Matt and I used to stop every once in a while and imagine what life would be like if our boys both conformed to traditional gender norms. It would be so easy to have two boys who acted like boys and were perfectly happy to be boys. When CJ was younger, there were moments when conformity seemed to reign supreme, and we felt life would have been much simpler if he weren't so against being part of the crowd. We are blessed beyond comprehension to have a gender nonconforming son. So, and there are some references of things in the back that are worth looking at. The back of the book has more hands-on kind of stuff. I'll stop here. A couple of things I want to say about this. I'll let you go. This is really a compendium of things that anybody interested in the gender world should be aware of. There are terms in here. Two things I think I want to just make sure you're aware of. There is actually a gender history timeline. And we go back as far, in this particular history timeline, 577 AD, when King Henry III of France frequently cross-dressed while dressed, and while dressed as a woman, was referred to as Her Majesty by the courtiers. So we're going back at least 500 years after the Christian era. Into sexuality, very interesting stuff to learn about. More on this is a very good book on it in the bibliography that I provided in the back. This is a really good chart for those who want to look at this. About the different styles and the combinations you could have between gender and sexuality. What else is there I think is worth looking at? There is a bibliography, I should say. I talk about cisgender privilege, and I want to make sure you're clear about that term. A list of cisgender identity privileges, if you're not familiar with the term cisgender, means to have a biologic sex that matches your gender identity and expression, resulting in other people accurately perceiving your gender. Now, this is really one of the hallmarks of how this culture in general looks at how we distinguish one gender role or from another and the presentation modes associated with it. I'd like to mention also that most of our gender presentation is in the form of clothing, and a few of the trinkets, the baubles and the rings and other things that sort of distinguish us. And each season, apparently in this culture now, we're looking for markers that distinguish the masculine from the feminine. We're finding less and less of those as males decide to usurp their own privilege and females decide to go their own way. So cisgender is one of those, and there's a whole bunch of things that make it ideal for somebody who's biologically born to follow the proscripts, because it makes life easier, supposedly makes life easier. On the other hand, if you're non-conforming, you find out there are things that you'll never learn except through experience and experiment. And that would put you in the trans category as that goes. Let's see, is there anything else that I can say? There is a story about a child in the back of this thing, and I printed it here. This is a CJ type child. This isn't CJ, But this child was allowed to go as a girl in the elementary school that she is going. By the way, use pronouns appropriate to what they wear, not what their biology is. So this child was allowed to go to the girls' room to, if she had to do urinating or number 2 or whatever. And they won this case in the school district, and I'm sure somebody will contest it, but at this point, a 6-year-old going to the girls' room, doing what she does, like all girls, is not a cause for creative craziness in, in a little girl's room at age 6. So I think that the rest of it's stuff you can name. And as far as my credential is concerned, I put a little bit of what I've done in the back here, so you know you're not talking to somebody who's off the turnip truck. Thank you so much.